We're ready to go. Take it away, Tom.
Okie doke. Welcome. We're going to talk about a group of plants today that are, having been around botany and teaching plants and trees for many years, I've often come across this difficulty of all these plants that sort of look like grass, and yet they're not grass. And in fact, they're not two or three things. They can be hundreds and hundreds of different things. And why? So we want to look at some of the major groups of these things and how they differ from one another. But we also want to ask a more general question about why nature seems to make so many plants that look alike. Both, I think, are interesting questions. Here are what have I got there? 6 different groups. There are 5 genera and a whole family of grasses. If we, those first 3 are all in the sedge family. What I'm going to talk about are what we call the true sedges in the genus Carex. True sedge doesn't mean the others aren't sedges. It just means that Carex is the biggest genus in that group. And then the genera for rushes, juncus, for cattails, typha, and for grasses, Poaceae, or the family Poaceae. So we're going to look at these 4 different groups of plants that in many ways look alike, and yet are actually quite different once you learn to see the differences. How do they differ? Well, they're all flowering plants. So let's just start for just a second and look at the basic structure of a flower. I remember showing this to someone decades ago when I was teaching at the Martin Arboretum, and I had a really big flower, and we went through it carefully, and they turned to me and they said, "That's the first time anyone ever pointed that out to me." So the basic flower has 4 parts: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. So sepal and petal are seral parts. The sepal generally green, though not always. The petal generally colored, though not always. The stamens are the male part. They produce pollen. The pistil, or sometimes called gynecium, or sometimes called carpel, is the female part, and that produces the egg, which can then be fertilized by the sperm nuclei of the pollen. So that's the basic structure of a flower: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. And as far as botanists know, the early flowers, well, of course, there's some debate on this in science. Scientists debate about everything, but sort of classic, very early flowering plant going back 100 million years have lots of sepals, lots of petals, lots of stamens, and lots of pistils, all these parts separate from one another, but a big, complex looking flower with many, many parts. So let's look at our first group, the cattails, and we'll see something radically different from that big, colorful flower. This is the female flower in all its glory of the cattail, and what it is a bunch of hair, and there's a little stipe, and then the ovary sits on top of it. Obviously, there was a stigma for receiving the pollen grain on top of that, but at the scale of this drawing, you have the ovary there. So that's all that's left of the flower, this incredibly simple little structure. The male is equally simple, just a tuft of hair and a couple of anthers, pollen-bearing antlers here. So when we look at the cattail, we can see a cluster of female flowers here in the hot dog shape that people often say the hot dog plant. This is the cluster of male flowers, and those disappear relatively quickly early in the growing season. Their only job is to produce pollen. Once that's produced, they fall off and leave the stick, the central axis of the male flowers behind them. So you have the hot dog and a stick look to a cattail. But look at the incredible simplicity of these flowers. There's basically only the actual ovary and attendant parts in the female flower, only the stamen left in the male flower. And if so we have this evolutionary trend going from big and complicated and complex down to extremely small and simple. That's That's probably different from what you think about in terms of evolution, where the typical trope of evolution is we go from bacteria to human beings, the so-called ultimate product of evolution, the most complex, brains and thoughts and all those sorts of things. So we tend to think about evolution as going from simple to complex, but in fact, in plants, it's often the case that in plant evolution, structures were simplified. Two structures were fused into one, or many were reduced down to few. And that's the actual trend you see mostly in plant evolution. So let's look at our next 30 species. Another point I want to make is 30 species is not very much for the entire world, and yet cattails cover huge areas of wetlands in many parts of the world. So even though it's not a species diverse group, in some ecological sense, it is very important in terms of its carbon sequestration, in terms of its food production. Its roots are the food for many different animals. So it's ecologically quite important, though relatively few in numbers of species. Let's look at rushes now. Rushes are a little bit different because their flower starts to look a little bit more like that classic flower. The sepals and petals are still there. They're just green. So we have 3 sepals, 3 petals, or just together you call the sepals and petals the perianth. So there's 6 perianth segments. Then you have clearly identifiable stamens with a filament and an anther, and then you have the ovary in the center with a style. So it's really very much like the classic flower, only in miniature. So if we then look at the seeds develop in these little capsules in the head, these are very common plants if you walk around in wet places. If any of you have done seed collection with us over in the School Springs area, there's lots and lots and lots of rushes growing on the ground. And toward the end of the year, you'll see these little BB-like capsules full of tiny seeds. And then subtending or below this cluster of formerly of flowers, and then our capsules are these bracts. Bracts are simply modified leaves that occur in association with flowers. So we got 2 cattails and now rushes, very different in their flower structure, even though both of them have thin, skinny, parallel leaves. 464 species, so much more diverse than cattails, and very, very common, though often not the dominant plants in a wetland, not the big plants that you see out in wetlands. But once you start walking in the wetlands and look down, you'll find they're relatively common and sometimes rather diverse. Sedges, carex are famously diverse in the Chicago area, something like 100 species of carex that occur in our woods, mostly in our woods and wetlands, a lesser number in our meadows and prairies. And here we have a very different flower structure. Here's the ovary, the style, the skinny part of the ovary, and then the stigma that receives the pollen on top. But in this case, this ovary is completely encased in a little sac. And that sac is the evolutionary product of a bract below the flower that just grew up and completely encircled the female part. So it's the only one of this group that has the ovary, or then the nutlet that forms within that inside of a sac. With sedges, the true sedges, like cattails, the male and female flowers are separate, and the male flower is extremely reduced down to just a few stamens. So again, division of sexes and simplification, mostly in the evolution of sedges from that prototypical early flowering plant. And this whole package of the nutlet inside of the sac is called the perigynia. And there's a spikelet of perigynia, or the flowers, and then perigynia of the sedges are arranged in spikelets. And you can see that's quite different from the rush flower that had sepal, petal, stamen, pistil, much like the classic flower, only in miniature. 2,000 species in the genus Carex, many more thousands if you include all the other sedges in related genera. So again, similar but different. Grasses, this is our largest group of grassy plants, because grasses are so common in upland situations, both in woods And in prairies, they're probably the most identifiable of the group of the ones we grow in our yards. And so that becomes the type name for everything that kind of looks like grasses when we walk in a wetland and we're walking through sedges. If we don't know what we're looking at, we often call it grass. Here the flowers, again, highly reduced. Sepals and petals are gone or almost gone. Botanists think these, what are called laticules, these bumps at the base of the flower, are actually what's left of the sepals and petals. But sure enough, inside of that, you have 3 stamens, and then you have a pistil, the ovary that has two styles and stigmas coming out to gather pollen. So again, highly reduced flower. Put together in a spikelet, and you probably didn't know this, but when you eat a cob of corn, you're eating a spikelet. Corn is a grass, and each one of these corn grains is an individual floret, flower of a grass that then matures into that grain. And these husks on the outside are the glooms, just many, many glooms that enclose the entire spikelet. So you can point that out to your family and friends the next time you eat corn on the cob. 11,500 species. So I think still the second most diverse group of flowering plants in the world. Orchids are around 28,000. Grasses, in terms of their biomass and coverage of the surface, are probably thousands of times a larger group than orchids, but orchids are well over twice as many in species. Just a quick look at comparison of stem structure here, cattails. With grasses and cattails, the leaves are 2 ranked, so it goes right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. In cattails, you can see they're back and forth. This is cutting across the stem. Sedges are 3 ranked. This is not one of the carex, but it's all the sedges. This is actually 3-way sedge in the genus Dolichium. The rushes are 3 ranked with a pithy stem, or sometimes really without any leaves at all, like this Juncus effusus. See how grass-like some of these plants look, even though they're not truly grasses. The next thing I want to do quickly is to look at why there are so many plants in these groups. I go back to Darwin's diagram as the only figure in the origin of species. If we look at this, we can see that plant B, C, D, E, F, G, H, K, and L, starting at this time down here, left no descendants. They just went extinct. Species A and I both give rise to many descendants. Most of those descendant species, you can see these lines end all over the place, but most of these descendant species go extinct. But you have this whole group of species here that derive from species I, and this whole group that is derived from species, A and I. And so all of these will carry many of the characteristics of A and tend to look alike. All these will carry many of the characteristics of species I and tend to look alike. So when we look at the actual evolution of what we call grassy plants, here are sedges and bulrushes. All of our sedges here are rushes and grasses and some other groups of grassy plants. All together, they all descend from this, I think this is the order Poales. All of these, if anyone refers to a graminoid wetland, they're referring to a wetland that's dominated by these plants. All these plants, which in a general, I think this is really a common name, we call graminoids. They all derive from a common ancestor, and they all tend to look alike. So why do we have so many plants that look alike? Well, it could be a lot of things that looked different that evolved to look alike, but that's probably not the case. More likely, you have many descendants of a common ancestor. Then you have differentiation of those descendants that occupy different ecological niches, and sometimes even those niches overlap. So you can walk through a wetland and see many, many plants that are grass-like, but they could be in 2 or 3 or 4 major groups and many, many different species. But do they actually really look like each other? And this is where I want to challenge you a little bit, because if you look at this picture, Now, we're used to looking at human beings. You've been looking at human faces since you were an infant, since you were born and opened your eyes and saw your mother's face. You're used to looking at faces, and we become incredibly good at seeing the patterns of faces and differentiating one from another. So if you look at this long enough, you see diversity. You start seeing the individuals. But imagine maybe that you're a Martian and you're looking down on this scene, and for the Martian is so completely different from us that we all tend to look alike. We're just these a sort of blob with two sticks that come out of the bottom, one to either side, a head on top that seems to have a fuzzy part on top, with what we call hair. So the the Martian would see us all as the same of this of redundancy rather than variation, just as we would tend to look at this spruce forest and see a repetition, a redundancy and sameness of parts, because at least in this aerial view, they all sort of look alike. If we got up close, if you worked with trees as much as I did and you were on the ground and looking at it, you would see them as individual trees, each differently shaped, and having its own individual characteristics. So likewise, when we got down to this individual level and looking at people, you would appreciate their differences and see that. And so I guess I'm using this as an analogy. When you don't know plants, you think all trees look alike. And then you learn about trees and you wonder how anyone could not have seen the difference between an oak and an elm. Likewise, when you learn sedges, or before you learn sedges, you look and they all look alike, and then you learn them and you don't understand why people don't see the diversity. So our appreciation of sameness and diversity in the natural world or the human world really has to do with how we develop that familiarity. And the more you become familiar with nature, the more you look at it, the more you study it, the more time you spend in it, the more of those fine variations you actually see. So with that, I want to stop and see what kind of questions we have. I mean, I can answer some identification questions, but that's kind of hard, but you can try me out. Like I say, there's 100 different sedges out there. So this is it's a huge group, an interesting group. It's one that particularly some of the larger groups like sedges, I still learn them. I learn them sort of opportunistically. If I have an area I have to study, like the School Springs mitigation site, Jackie and I go over there and we do vegetation surveys each summer. And each summer I have to go back, kind of not relearn completely because I know them, but I have to refamiliarize myself with all the plants that are out there so that I can see them at a glance. But it's really not that hard to do. Once you learn things, suddenly what were microscopically differences suddenly become obvious. When I can remember when I was first learning trees, I was taught the difference between sugar maple and Norway maple, which still confuse a lot of people. And I often wonder why they can't see the difference, because now I can walk past a tree on the other side of the street and just glance over and see the difference. And it's awfully hard for other people. And it's simply a matter of familiarity. Now the two plants shout their name at me. If you're not familiar with, they just look alike, and you strain and strain and strain and can't tell the difference. So I guess that's my encouragement for you to learn things, because things that initially seem very confusing, that all look alike, that are very difficult, will become easy. And they become easy as you become familiar with them. The more you look at them, the more the differences pop out at you when you look at them. And you see that difference in the first instant you look at it. You don't even try. It's just there. It's just there when you look at it.
And just as a reminder, we have a couple options for asking questions. You can unmute and ask, or you can type it in the chat. Got a couple questions to start off. So
Okay.
did you say there's 30 species of cattails? If so, how many species are native to Illinois?
Exactly one. Cattails are very common, but it's a common, or sometimes called broadleaf cattail. I think it's really properly called cattail, but because we have an invasive narrowleaf cattail, then when people say cattail, they don't want to be misunderstood, so they call it the broadleaf cattail. So we have exactly one native species. There's an invasive narrowleaf cattail that comes from, I think, from salt marshes in the east. that has become common. Even more of a problem is that hybridizes with a common cattail, the cattail, our native cattail, and produces a hybrid that is super aggressive. And also those hybrids intergress with the parents, and you get the whole maze of different hybrids and intergressed things out there, and that's become a huge problem in our wetlands in wetland management. Normally, when you look at a wetland today, if it's a sea of cattails, it's a sea of hybrid cattails. The actual native, I'll use that word, broadleaf cattail is actually usually very uncommon. If you keep looking, you'll eventually find it, but it's hard to find.
There's another question in the chat. They said, where I'm a steward, we have a very large colony of Carex pallida that was ID'd by an ecologist, but it never seems to bloom. Any ideas what would cause that?
No, I don't know. I know that many of the large perennial sedges don't produce abundant flowers and perigynia each year. I mean, I've often found that going through a stand of Carex stricta, it's hard to find a blooming specimen. Some other sedge species like fox sedge, every year they produce an abundance of perigynia. So part of that, I think, is just the flowering and fruiting strategy of the species. I don't know in your case whether that's, I don't know how many years you've been looking, but whether that's, I doubt it's a permanent condition, but it could be that it just happens relatively infrequently. Usually, I believe with Carex pallida, I've found perigynia in the past. It's one of those ones I've keyed out from the perigynia. So perhaps if you keep looking or look through the whole stand, maybe there'll be a few flowering and fruiting specimens.
That's all we have in the chat. I saw one partially typed question, so if you want to ask unmuted or try typing again, go for it. Otherwise, we'll be finishing up shortly.
Yeah, I apologize. I somehow submitted it too early. I was just wondering if you pretty much pinned down the sedge species in McHenry County, or do you discover a new one every couple of years?
I don't. Well, that's really a better question for Lori Ryan. She keeps track of these things. I mean, it's always possible you can find a new species of a genus as large as Carex. You know, we could be on the fringes of the range of several species and eventually find one. I think that that's certainly possible. I don't know whether they've come up with any new species of Carex over the last few decades, though. It's always possible.
They're really big group. I know sedges, that's one of the ones I'd say beginners have a really hard time with. Experts still have a hard time with many of them. So it's good to get some practice and get out there and just see all the little differences, like Tom was saying, familiarity.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that you will eventually find a microscope somewhere, and it will unlock a whole new. I look at it, you know, I look at through my hand lens a lot, partially because my close-up vision is as good as it used to be. But when you look at things in magnification, particularly in a microscope, you see this whole other world of nature's beauty. And that's not a trite phrase. I mean, you see this whole other world of nature's beauty and structure that's pretty much invisible to the naked eye. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And when you look at that, then there's a whole another category of characters that you can see and differentiate. Most of the Carex, most of them can be pretty conclusively identified by a person of moderate expertise, which I would maybe classify myself, if you take your time. There are a few that are really very hard, and you have to send them to experts. I mean, there's nothing, you know, there are a few insects that are very hard. You have to send them to experts. There are a few, I remember the panicum grasses in the South when I was working down there. Basically, there was one guy that lived somewhere in Southern Alabama. You had to send your specimens to find out what they were. There was such an incredibly diverse genus down there, and no one seemed to know or be able to key them out very well. So yeah, there's some groups of plants that are really hard to work with, but thank goodness there are some people who dedicate their life to doing it. So you can tap them.
All right, well, I think that's all we got. I think the vacuum's coming for me in the background here, so I think we'll head out for today. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you for coming today, and we'll see you next week, I hope.